I'll keep my introductory remarks to a minimum. I just want to thank the founders of this lecture, and especially Father Allen for his lovely hospitality and making all of the arrangements for me to be here. I'm going to leave out the jokes that speakers usually start with, and that's no loss to you, because one of the things I've discovered is that philosophers are just not funny. So, nothing lost. My title, Does Neuroscience Teach That We Have No Souls? I've spent a lot of effort during my career combating the myth that Christianity and science are at war, and that Christians have always backed down. I've also worked at showing ways various sciences can contribute to theological reflection. For example, I've just come from Mercer University, where I gave a lecture that included some recent developments in cosmology that have put questions about the doctrine of creation back on the theological agenda, having been abandoned in the modern period. The warfare myth usually focuses on Galileo, a good Catholic by the way, and on Darwin. My lecture today is intended to address what some see as a new locus of conflict, that between neuroscience and traditional conceptions of mind or soul. For example, geneticist Francis Crick identifies body-soul dualism with religion, and because neuroscience, he says, has shown that there is no soul, this is, quote, in head-on contradiction to the religious beliefs of billions of human beings today, end quote. Now, I, among many Christian scholars, also believe that neuroscience makes the idea of a non-material mind or soul unnecessary to account for human cognition and behavior. However, we also recognize that most Christians throughout most of Christian history have been dualists of one sort or another. So the question of whether dualism is essential Christian teaching, many Christian scholars have concluded that it is not. Original Hebrew and Christian thinking is more compatible with what is most often called physicalism. That is, we are purely physical beings. An important caveat needs to be made, though. Our human nature cannot be reduced to mere biology. Here is another Francis Crick-ism. Quote, you, your joys and sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are, in fact, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells, end quote. So my main scholarly occupation for the past 20 years has been to work out how to give a non-reductive account of human higher capacities, even though we are thoroughly physical organisms. My plan in this lecture is to present some of the interesting findings from neuroscience that make dualism problematic. But my main objective is to show that Christian teaching does not require dualism and suggest that non-reductive physicalism actually comes closer to biblical thought. Now, if any of you are planning to go to Chestnut Hill tomorrow evening, I want to let you know that there's going to be a section of overlap in my paper this afternoon and the one in the evening, but I included some material in this paper and that's different from what I'll be talking about tomorrow. So, section 1, what does neuroscience have to say? I've spoken on the topic of dualism versus physicalism for many years, perhaps in 100 different locations. More than once, after arguing for physicalism, a question arises. A student asks me, so what is your concept of the soul? Although so far I've restrained myself, I always want to stamp my foot and shout, I just spent 45 minutes trying to show you that there is no such thing as a soul. In addition, concepts of soul in Christian history have been so varied that I would bore you to tears by even trying to describe them all. Two philosophers have had particularly strong influences. Plato, living 400 years before Christ, emphasized the eternal, immaterial essence of the person and its escape to the heavenly realm at death. Augustine, living 400 years after Christ, made significant adaptations to Plato's concept for use in his theology. Now, I'm going to be speaking more about Aristotle, Plato's student, today than about Augustine, and so you have a handout. I don't know if there are enough of them, but I'm going to go through a lot of the terminology that Thomas Aquinas used when he adapted Aristotle's concept of the soul for his theological purposes. Aristotle, Plato's student, developed a metaphysical system that is strange to us now called hylomorphism. This is to say that all material things are made of the same stuff, but what makes rocks, plants, horses, humans, and so on different from one from another is their forms, and this is a technical philosophical term. The form of a statue may simply be its shape, but the forms of different kinds of stone, for example, are the principles of their nature that give them their essential qualities. The forms of living things are also called their souls, and these give them their typical capacities and direct their development. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century is most famous for incorporating Aristotle's concept of the soul into his theology. Aristotle and his followers, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, were keen observers of human nature, distinguishing all of the functions that the soul was supposed to play in human life. So if I did have a concept of the soul, I would prefer Thomas's, and of course many Catholic theologians hold the doctrine that the soul is the form of the body as well. However, our whole sense of the nature of reality changed with the scientific revolution in the 17th century, and to me there just doesn't seem to be any room in our contemporary worldview for this technical concept of form. Nonetheless, I'd like to use Thomas's account of the functions and capacities we have as a way of organizing the developments in biology, and especially neuroscience, to show that we no longer need the concept of the soul. But since this is a lecture on Augustine and science, I'll say a little below on similarities between Thomas and Augustine. Aristotle and Thomas attributed souls to plants and animals. The human soul is tripartite, incorporating all of the capacities of both plant and animal souls, as well as our own particular rational soul. The vegetative or plant soul, in the first instance, is simply the life principle. Our word animate comes from the Latin word for soul, anima. The question of what makes something alive, though, is now handled by biology. Biologists today ask what the minimum requirements are for life. The basics are self-maintenance, growth, and reproduction. Thus, a sphere of proteins and other large molecules is living if first, it has a membrane separating it from its environment. Second, the membrane is permeable enough to allow for the intake of nutrients. Third, it has the ability to repair itself if damaged. And fourth, the ability to reproduce, even if only by splitting into two spheres, each of which then grows large enough to split again. The three functions Thomas attributed to the vegetative soul, as you can see on your handout, were growth, nutrition, and reproduction. The one feature he failed to note was self-repair. Now, the physicalist's thesis is that as we go up the hierarchy of increasingly complex organisms, all of the other capacities once attributed to the soul will also turn out to be the products of complex organization rather than properties of a non-material entity. The faculties Thomas attributed to the animal or sensitive soul were locomotion, appetite, sensation, and emotion. Let's consider just some of these. Thomas's distinction between plant and animal on the basis of the ability to move from one place to another is still accepted. I once heard a lecturer describe a marine organism on the borderline between plant and animal. It spends most of its time attached to rocks, but during one phase of its life, it develops a simple brain, detaches from the rock, moves to an area with more nutrients, and then eats its own brain. The lecturer likened it to a professor who had gotten tenure. I can tell that people in the back of the room can hear me. The earliest and simplest form of locomotion is found in single-celled organisms equipped with flagella, whip-like structures on the surface of the cells that rotate and drive the cell forward. In humans and other higher animals, locomotion is controlled by a strip of cortex across the top of the brain, appropriately labeled the motor cortex. Thomas distinguished two sorts of appetite. The sort we share with animals is that which is directed toward sensible objects, such as food or mates. Sense appetite includes a pleasure-seeking drive that includes animals and humans to pursue what pleases their senses and avoid what hurts them. In higher animals, it is mediated by the pleasure centers of the brain and is dependent on a balance of neurotransmitters. These are the chemicals that facilitate transmission of impulses from one nerve to another. Sexual desire is highly dependent on hormones. The hormone oxytocin is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland in mammals during sexual intercourse and breastfeeding. It has been found to be a significant factor in pair bonding in animals and facilitates mother-infant bonding in humans. A lot of research has been done on the role of the brain in sense perception. For example, visual perception in higher animals has developed from single light-sensitive cells in primitive organisms. In humans, signals are transmitted from light-sensitive cells in the retina through a series of processors to the visual cortex. The striking difference between lower and higher animals is that while the lower ones can respond to stimuli in their environments, they do so without knowing what they are doing. They lack consciousness. There's a phenomenon called blindsight that helps clarify the difference between conscious and non-conscious perception. Certain victims of damage to the visual cortex are either completely blind or have blind spots in their visual fields. Nonetheless, they are apparently receiving information about their environments. If they're asked to say where an object is, they'll say they don't know, I'm blind. But if told to reach for it, they do much better than would be expected by chance. So the value of consciousness is that we not only know things about our environment, but we also know that we know. How consciousness arises from the brain is, as neuroscientists say, the really hard problem. Since experts still don't agree on how this happens, I myself, being merely a philosopher, feel free to skip it over. So back to Thomas. In addition to the 5 exterior senses, he postulated 4 interior senses. These are particularly interesting in they show Thomas's skill as a cognitive scientist, and they also link up with quite detailed work in neuroscience. These are attributes shared with higher animals. Here is Timothy McDermott's contemporary translation of Thomas's account. Quote, higher animals must be aware of something not only when it is present to their senses, but also in its absence, so they can be prompted to seek it. So they not only need to receive, but also to retain impressions of sense objects presently affecting them. This ability to retain sense impressions in the absence of the stimulus is the interior sense called the Fantasia in Latin and often translated as imagination. In addition, animals need to be attracted and repelled not only what pleases or displeases their senses, but by what is useful or harmful in other ways. The straws birds collect must look good for nest building. So animals must be able to perceive a significance in things that is not merely an externally perceptible quality. In addition to their particular senses for receiving sense impressions and their imagination for storing them, animals must therefore have an instinctive judgment, the vis estimativa, also translated estimative power, and a memory, vis memorativa, or sense memory, for storing those. Particular senses discern the particular sense stimuli proper to them, but to distinguish, for example, white from sweet, we need some common root sensitivity in which all sense perceptions meet, the sensus communis, the common or unifying sense. End quote. In this last sentence, Thomas is raising the issue that neuroscientists call the binding problem. That is, how is it that we can put together the sound of the bark, the sight of brown hair, the sensation of furriness, and the smell to recognize that what we have before us is a dog? This is considered to be one of the hardest problems in neuroscience, next to consciousness itself. An important question in neuroscience has been a controversy over how the brain comes to recognize patterns. It's now believed that recognition tasks depend on activation of large nets of neurons. The concept of a cell assembly is described as follows. Any frequently repeated particular stimulation will lead to the slow development of a cell assembly, a diffuse structure comprising cells capable of acting briefly as a closed system. This issue is clearly relevant to an understanding of Thomas's Fantasia, in that it is the reactivation of such an assembly that accounts for memory of the original stimuli. Thomas's vis estimativa is a particularly interesting faculty from the point of view of neuroscience. Joseph Ledoux is well known for investigating emotion. What he writes about emotional appraisal is relevant to distinguishing this estimative power from the sensus communis. He says, when a certain region of the brain is damaged, namely the temporal lobe, animals or humans lose the capacity to appraise the emotional significance of certain stimuli, but without any loss in the capacity to perceive the stimuli as objects. The perceptual representation of an object and the evaluation of the significance of an object are separately processed in the brain. In fact, the emotional meaning of a stimulus can begin to be appraised before the perceptual systems have fully processed the stimulus. It is indeed possible, he says, for your brain to know that something is good or bad before it knows exactly what it is, end quote. So putting it back in Thomas's terms, the vis estimativa is a separate faculty from the sensus communis, and it works faster. Thomas emphasized that the vis estimativa is also capable of recognizing intentions. Leslie Brothers describes the neural basis for such recognition in humans and animals. Social animals come equipped with neural systems that predispose them to pick out faces. The amygdala is necessary for interpreting facial expressions, direction of gaze, and tone of voice. Neurons in the same region respond to the sight of hands and to leg motions typical of walking. Thus, there are particular neurons whose function is to respond to visual stimuli that indicate the intentions of other agents. I tried this out on my cat one time, and so I expected him to recognize my hand ordinarily, but instead of just putting my hand out, I made walking motions with 2 fingers. and it freaked him out so much it was the first time he ever really bit me. Ledoux's research is also relevant to Thomas' vis memorativa, the ability to remember the emotional significance of a stimulus. He tells of a patient of a French physician named Edouard Claparède, who had lost her abilities to create new memories as the result of brain damage. Ledoux reports that each time Claparède walked into the room, he had to reintroduce himself to her, as she had no recollection of having seen him before. He regularly held out his hand to greet her, but one day when their hands met, she quickly pulled hers back, for Claparède had concealed a tack in the palm of his hand and had pricked her with it. The next time he returned, she still had no recognition of him, but she refused to shake his hand and could not tell him why. He had become a stimulus with a specific emotional meaning. She learned that Claparède's hand could cause her harm, and her brain had stored this information to prevent the unpleasantness from occurring again. By investigating fear conditioning in rats, Ledoux has confirmed the crucial role of the amygdala, a distinctive cluster of neurons found in the anterior temporal lobe of each hemisphere, in developing this sort of memory. For Thomas, the rational soul is what makes us distinctively human. He attributed to it two sorts of intellect, passive and active, and will. The active intellect is the power humans have, but not animals, of acquiring abstract information from sense experience and forming judgments. Its capacities are expressed primarily in the use of language. Passive intellect is a kind of memory, a memory of facts and ideas. Neuroscientists now distinguish something like a dozen different memory systems. The two sorts of memory that Thomas distinguished are both classified as types of declarative memory and involve the medial temporal lobe of the brain. The formation of long-term memory requires the functioning of the hippocampus. The functions Thomas attributed to the active intellect, abstraction, judgment, and reasoning, are less well understood in neurobiological terms than are the faculties shared with animals. However, all of these higher human capacities depend on language, and a great deal of work has been done on the neural bases of language use. Two regions have long been known to be involved, Wernicke's area and Broca's area. This is just the beginning of an understanding of the very complex brain processes that enable us to engage in language-based reasoning. The third of Thomas's rational faculties was the will. This is the capacity to be attracted to goods of a non-sensory sort. As Anthony Kenny says, the will is a power to have wants that only the intellect can frame. We can say roughly that the human will is the power to have those wants which only a language user can have, end quote. Along with the intellect, this is the seat of moral capacities. Furthermore, since God is the ultimate good, the will accounts for the capacity to be attracted to God. Neuroscience now contributes to our understanding of both morality and religious experience. Antonio Damasio has studied the neural processes that go into practical reasoning, that is, the ability to make both moral and prudential judgments. In his book, Descartes' Error, he reports the case of a 19th century railway worker, Phineas Gage, whose brain was pierced by a metal rod. Gage recovered physically, and his cognitive functions, attention, perception, memory, reasoning, language, were all intact, yet he suffered a dramatic character change after the accident. His doctor noted that he had become, quote, fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, manifesting little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, devising many plans of future operation which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned, end quote. Hannah Damasio was able to determine from the damage to Gage's skull exactly which parts of the brain would have been destroyed. Selected areas of his prefrontal cortices. The Damasios conclude from this and similar cases that this area is, quote, concerned specifically with unique human properties, among them the ability to anticipate the future and plan accordingly within a complex social environment, the sense of responsibility toward the self and others, and the ability to orchestrate one's survival deliberately at the command of one's free will, end quote. In short, what Thomas described as the appetite for the good appears to depend on localizable brain functions. A number of scientists have begun to study the role of the brain in religious experience. For example, Andrew Newberg has studied Buddhist monks during meditation and Franciscan nuns during prayer, and shows particular regions of the brain to be typically activated. I'm often asked to comment on these brain imaging studies. I always point out that one is a physicalist, as I am. In fact, some regions would have to be. I also point out that these studies say nothing about the existence or non-existence of God. So far in this section, I have gone down one of the most detailed lists available of the human capacities that in the past have been attributed to the soul, but I've barely scratched the surface of the scientific work that has been done on each of these. Now, a little on Augustine. Thanks to an entry Father Fitzgerald gave me from an encyclopedia he co-edited on Augustine, written by Stephen Duffy, I have an overview of the capacities Augustine attributed to the soul, and there are a lot of parallels with Thomas, since both were influenced by Aristotle. Just as for Thomas, the soul is the life principle of the body, caring for nutrition, growth, and reproduction. It distinguishes what is or is not agreeable to the body. It determines desire, the life of the senses. It is the seat of memory, intellect, both superior and inferior, and especially of will. Importantly, both Augustine and Thomas emphasized that God created humans as both body and soul, in contrast to thinkers who believe we are souls, merely temporarily inhabiting bodies. Thus, my conclusion is that Augustine might best be called, in today's terms of debate, a holistic dualist. Now, someone might be thinking at this point that in talking about the soul, I have left out the most important thing. It's the part of us that goes to heaven. I'll come back to this below. Section 2, the re-evaluation of Christian dualism. I mentioned at the beginning the conflict myth, including the perception that in the end, religionists always back down. This stereotype is still so influential that when I argue for a physicalist anthropology on the basis of theology and biblical studies, and then point to the happy fact that theology and science are in agreement here, some people nonetheless take me to be knuckling under to science. Yet Christian scholars had already begun to question whether dualism was the view of the Bible over 100 years ago, and by the middle of the 20th century had come to a near consensus that dualism was not a part of original Christian teaching and ought to be rejected as Greek acculturation. Now, this is an oversimplification in several ways. First, the dynamics in Catholic theology and biblical studies are more complex. Due to my location in a Protestant environment, I know less about this, and perhaps some of the you who are here can help fill in some details. Second, whenever one speaks of Protestant thought in the U.S., it's always necessary to recognize that conservatives and liberals are sharply divided. So the Debates about biblical concepts of human nature and life after death had been taken up by liberal scholars in the U.S. in the first half of the century. Now, half a century later, similar issues are being debated by conservative Protestants. However, whatever was decided in liberal seminaries and universities 60 years ago, it apparently never leaked out to the churches. Among the audiences in the U.S., I find that the vast majority are either body-soul dualists or else hold a tripartite or trichotomist view of humans as body, soul, and spirit. So it might be worthwhile to say a little bit about why the dualism issue is so hard to lay to rest. That is, Christians for about 17 centuries took the Bible to be teaching dualism. If they were wrong, this seems to need an explanation. The first issue was the question of whether body-soul dualism was the teaching of the Old Testament. The first to raise it was H. Wheeler Robinson in 1911. It is now recognized by nearly all scholars that there is no dualism as we understand it in the Old Testament. The reason that Christians and Jews could so easily read it dualistically was that the Old Testament was translated into Greek with the work completed around 250 BC. The result is called the Septuagint. Thus, Greek anthropological terms were used to translate Hebrew terms. For example, the Greek word suke was used to translate the Hebrew word nephesh. Pneuma was used to translate ruach. Later readers then read them in light of their meanings in Greek philosophy and have translated them accordingly into modern languages as soul and spirit, respectively. But then we might raise the question of why the translators who produced the Septuagint used what we now see to be inappropriate word choices for Hebraic anthropological terms. Biblical scholar James Dunn, usually called Jimmy Dunn, offers a compelling explanation. Dunn distinguishes what he calls aspective and partitive accounts of human nature, aspective versus partitive. Greek philosophers tended to be interested in a partitive account. What are the essential parts that make up a human being? In contrast, the biblical authors were interested in an aspective account. Here, each part, and part needs to be in scare quotes, stands for the whole person thought of from a certain angle. So, for example, Paul's distinction between spirit and flesh is not the later distinction between soul and body. Paul is concerned with two ways of living, one in conformity with the Spirit of God, and the other in conformity to the concerns of the world, many of which involved concerns with family, kinship, and ethnicity, hence the word flesh. Let me illustrate Dunn's distinction with documents from my own Christian tradition beginning in the 1500s. This tradition is politely called the Radical Reformation tradition and was described pejoratively as the Anabaptists or the rebaptizers. The most common representation today are the Mennonites, and my little Church of the Brethren was largely shaped later by their thought and practices. I have a book titled Bodies and Souls or Spirited Bodies, and it's the one of my books that is most often misunderstood. So imagine my excitement to find that a whole issue of a Mennonite Brethren journal had been devoted to it. Unfortunately, the reviews were awful. In one case, the answer is clearly that while the author repeated what I've just told you about aspective versus partitive uses of these terms, he apparently didn't understand it. So I can use his review to reinforce this point. I state that physicalism is easier to reconcile with my own Christian subtradition than with Catholicism or Calvinism. The reason is that both Calvin and the Catholic Church have given doctrinal status to the so-called intermediate state. That is, a period of conscious awareness between the believer's death and the general resurrection at the end of history. It seems to some that the only way to make sense of this doctrine is to assume that we have a soul that will continue to be conscious during that time. But this has never been an essential teaching for Anabaptists, nor for Luther, or apparently for Augustine, who says, according to Duffy, that in the eschaton, the whole person, body, and soul will be raised. This is consistent with the Anabaptist idea of soul sleep. But since sleep is a metaphor for death in the New Testament, it can also stand for the death of the soul during the intervening time. On the basis of my claim that physicalism is easier for an Anabaptist to accept, the author of the review, Terry Hebert, takes me to be making a much more radical claim that the early Anabaptists were not dualists, and he provides a historical account to show that in fact they were. He concludes his review by saying that, quote, historic Anabaptist writers and church confessions were remarkably unified in using the biblical language of the soul. Apparently most Anabaptists were dualists, end quote. But shortly afterwards, he says, quote, Anabaptists practiced a restrained use of this interior language of the soul in worship and ministry. They believed in the soul's engagement with God and people through baptism, the Lord's Supper, and so on. This rich metaphor evokes the moral, emotional, relational, volitional, rational, and spiritual dimensions of human experience. So notice how he has shifted in his use of the word soul in these two passages. In the first, he is attributing a partitive use of the term to the Anabaptists. The soul is a separate thing from the body. But in the second, he's very clearly using soul in an aspective way, as a spiritual and relational dimension of human life. And with few exceptions, all of the uses of the term soul, spirit, and flesh that he cites are aspective. One important source was Michael Sattler. Hebert says that for Sattler, flesh and spirit are scriptural terms contrasting the life devoted to Christ with that yoked to Belial. And I could fairly add to that, so neither flesh nor spirit is a part of the person. Hebert says that both Sattler and Menno Simons referred to the soul as, quote, a believer's openness to God, end quote. One notable exception in those early years was Balthasar Hubmaier. He is one of the few theologians in church history, and he taught that humans are composed of three substances, flesh, soul, and spirit, which separate at death. His is clearly a partitive use of the terms. I hope that this quick look at a small piece of church history not only clarifies Dunn's concept of aspective uses of anthropological terms, but will also promote what psychologists call a gestalt switch for readers of Scripture, a strategy for reading terms such as soul, mind, and spirit that does not automatically commit Christians to body-soul dualism. This negative conclusion would certainly mean that Christians are free to consider non-reductive physicalism as an option. This view is quite close, I claim, to ancient Hebrew conceptions of the person. It maintains the holistic view of the person found in both the Old and New Testaments, and it has some definite theological advantages over dualism. One of the most important is that it forces us to attend to New Testament teachings about bodily resurrection as the source of Christian hope for eternal life. Here's where the differences between physicalism and dualism will have a big impact. It's one thing to read scholars' commentaries in the library. It's quite another to talk about these things at a funeral. One of the clearest places dualism has had an impact is on what Christians think happens at death. I recognize the comfort it brings to imagine that a loved one is not really dead, but is just gone. However, I believe that I stand with the majority of contemporary scholars in saying that such a view is not part of original Christian teaching about life after death. The original view was that the whole person dies, but the whole person will later, at the end of history, be raised from death. The model for this death and resurrection, of course, is that of Jesus. Paul writes to the church at Corinth that if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain, and those who have died in Christ have perished. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have died. So we can see that there are now two quite different accounts of life after death available in Western philosophies and religions. One is the more common notion that humans possess an immortal soul which will survive death. The other is the expectation that the entire person will be raised or recreated at the end of history. Now, many Christians, including Catholics, have worked out a hybrid in which the soul survives in an intermediate state, awaiting the return of the body at the end. However, I am supposing that the original Christian view was simply death followed by bodily resurrection. On this view, nothing of value is lost if one adopts a physicalist account of the person. It's time to sum up. I have suggested that we've been mistaken to think that the Bible requires dualism. We've been misled by the way later Christians translated the Hebrew and Greek. There are topics on which the Bible teaches, though, that definitely rule out certain views, such as the body-denying dualism of Plato and the reductionistic materialism of some scientists and philosophers today. This leaves us with two views of the person. Each could be supported by proof texts from the New Testament, but the real question is whether the views are compatible with the rest of Christian theology. Both non-reductive physicalism and holistic dualism that recognizes that our bodies are essential to our humanness seem to be usable theological accounts, although there are a few problems in reconciling each of these with the theological tradition. So I'm not urging the rejection of dualism by those who hold it. What I hope to have accomplished is to show that Christians have options. We might even find that non-reductive physicalism fits better than dualism with much of the Bible. It may be one of those cases where a development in science helps us see more clearly what is in our scriptures than we could see before. I had the opportunity recently to teach a doctoral seminar on human nature with my theologian colleague, Veli-Matti Karkinen. He rejects dualism and says that the best of current theologians do also. But he did not like my term non-reductive physicalism because he thought it emphasized the physical at the expense of all of our other characteristics. There's another term that is sometimes used for a non-dualist position, namely dual aspect monism. That is, we are unified beings, but we have both physical and spiritual aspects. But this distinction of physical versus spiritual seems also too simplistic. So based on the complex account Scripture gives of the various aspects of human life, we decided that the best term for Christian theology would be multi-aspect monism. To illustrate, and for a fitting conclusion, I again quote Jamie Dunn on Paul's conception of human nature. Dunn says, Paul's conception of the human person is of a being who functions within several dimensions. As embodied beings, we are social, defined in part by our need for and ability to enter into relationships, not as an optional extra, but as a dimension of our very existence. Our fleshness attests to our frailty and weakness as mere humans, the inescapableness of our death, our dependence on satisfaction of appetite and desire, our vulnerability to manipulation of these desires and appetites. At the same time, as rational beings, we are capable of soaring to the highest heights of reflective thought. And as experiencing beings, we are capable of the deepest emotions and the most sustained motivation. We are living beings animated by the mystery of life as a gift, and there is a dimension of our being at which we are directly touched by the profoundest reality within and behind the universe. Paul would no doubt say in thankful acknowledgement with the psalmist, "I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Thank you.